The bullet had not killed Elijah Stone, but the silence it left behind very nearly did. He had been riding the dusty stretch between Abilene and the Red River country when the ambush caught him. 3 men with rifles, and no intention of leaving witnesses. And the shot that grazed the side of his skull had stolen something from him that no doctor west of the Mississippi fully understood. He could still hear the wind moving through buffalo grass. He could hear the creak of saddle leather and the low rumble of distant thunder rolling across the Kansas plains. But human voices had gone completely silent to him, as if the world had decided that the particular frequency of a human throat was no longer something he deserved. He watched mouths move. He saw expressions shift and eyes fill with meaning. But the words themselves arrived at the place inside him where sound was supposed to matter and simply dissolved, the way morning frost dissolved when the sun finally decided to show its face over the eastern ridgeline. That had been in the spring of 1878. 3 years had passed since then. 3 years of traveling from town to town with his hat pulled low and his answers short, nodding and shaking his head when men asked him questions, pressing coins into palms when he needed something bought, riding fast and riding alone. He had drifted from Kansas to Colorado Territory, from Colorado Territory down through New Mexico, and finally eastward again into Texas, into the hill country where the limestone bluffs rose pale and dramatic out of the cedar-covered earth, and the rivers ran clear and cold even in August. He had settled, if a man like Elijah Stone could be said to settle, in a small town called Calla Springs, which sat at the bottom of a long valley between 2 low ridges and had no particular reason for existing, except that a rancher named Horace Brill had needed a town nearby and had therefore built one. Calla Springs had a livery. It had a dry goods store. It had a saloon that doubled as a hotel on nights when travelers came through. It had a church made of whitewashed limestone that a circuit preacher visited every 3rd Sunday, and it had, as of the spring of 1881, a new schoolteacher. Elijah had been in the livery when she arrived. He did not know she had arrived. He was bent over the left rear hoof of his roan gelding, cleaning out a small stone that had wedged itself into the frog of the hoof, when something made him look up some shift in the quality of light through the open livery doors, or some vibration in the ground, or simply that animal instinct a man develops after 3 years of learning to read the world without one of its primary languages. He looked up and saw her standing in the street outside. She was not what men in dime novels described when they described beautiful women. She was not delicate. She was not pale and trembling. She was a solid, capable-looking woman of perhaps 25 or 26 years, with dark auburn hair that had been pinned up with what appeared to be more determination than success, several strands escaping to curl against the back of her neck in the August heat. She wore a plain blue traveling dress that was dusty from the road and practical in cut, and she carried a leather satchel in one hand and a crate of books balanced against her hip with the other. She was talking to old Jasper Coyne, who ran the livery, and even from across the street Elijah could see that she was not nervous about being in a new place. Her chin was level. Her shoulders were straight. Whatever she was saying to Jasper, she appeared to mean it fully. He found himself watching her for longer than was polite. Then Jasper pointed across the street toward the livery, and the woman turned and looked directly at Elijah, and even at that distance he could see that her eyes were the color of Good Creek water in October, green shot through with brown, changeable and alive. He looked back down at his horse's hoof. He heard nothing, as always. But for the first time in a very long while, the silence did not feel quite so absolute. Her name, as Elijah learned over the following days through the slow and imperfect method of reading people's lips, and occasionally asking Jasper to write things down for him, was Harriet Alden. She had come from Austin, where she had been teaching at a school there, until the school had run out of money to pay her, which was apparently a common enough problem in Texas in those years that she had taken it without excessive bitterness. She had accepted the position in Calla Springs through a letter of correspondence with the town's unofficial mayor, a stout cattle broker named Caleb Marsh, who had promised her a schoolroom, a modest salary, and a room in the boarding house run by his sister-in-law, Mrs. Agnes Tully. What he had failed to mention in the letter was that the schoolroom was currently being used as a storage space for lumber, that the salary would come in part from the voluntary donations of the ranchers in the valley who may or may not choose to donate, and that Mrs. Tully's boarding house was a structure that had been built with great optimism and very limited carpentry skill. Harriet Alden, from what Elijah could observe, handled all of this with a steady practicality that he found deeply impressive. On her second day in Calla Springs, he saw her physically removing lumber from the schoolroom by herself, carrying planks 2 at a time out into the street and stacking them neatly against the side wall. On her third day, she appeared at the dry goods store and spent what looked like a very deliberate and possibly argumentative amount of time with the owner before emerging with a quantity of chalk and a small chalkboard. On her fourth day, she posted a handwritten notice on the door of the saloon, which was also, by default, the primary community gathering point, announcing that school would begin on Monday and that children between the ages of 5 and 14 were expected to attend. Elijah watched all of this from various distances, as was his habit. He had a small cabin on the western edge of town that belonged to a rancher named Holt, who had hired him on as a general hand mending fence, tracking strays, the kind of work that required more endurance than conversation. The work suited him. The cabin suited him. The distance suited him. What did not suit him, what had not suited him for 3 years now, was the look he sometimes saw on people's faces when they realized he could not hear them. That specific combination of pity and discomfort that made them pull back, speak more slowly in the exaggerated way that did nothing to help him, since the problem was not in the clarity of their speech, but in the silence inside his own skull. He had learned to recognize that look coming before it arrived, and to remove himself from the situation before he had to endure it again. He expected to see it on Harriet Alden's face eventually. He expected it the way he expected rain in the fall, not as a surprise, but simply as a condition of the world. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, in the second week of September 1881, when Elijah was leaving the dry goods store with a wrapped parcel of tobacco and a tin of coffee, and walked directly into Harriet Alden, who was coming out of the alley beside the store at a speed that suggested she was late for something. The collision sent her crate of primers. She had ordered them from a bookseller in San Antonio, and they had apparently just arrived, scattering across the wooden sidewalk in a cascade that caused every person within earshot to look over. Elijah immediately bent to help gather them, as any man with basic manners would, and he was handing her the last one when she looked up at him and said something. Her expression was not annoyed. It was warm, actually slightly breathless, and a little amused at herself for the collision, and her lips were moving with what he suspected was either an apology or some light remark about her own hurry. He did not know which it was. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he did what he always did, which was to hand over the last book and nod and prepare to move on before the uncomfortable part arrived. But Harriet Alden did not let the conversation end there. She said something else, and when he did not respond, she said it again, and this time he caught enough of the shape of the words on her lips that he thought she was asking if he was all right, possibly because the look on his face had been, as he was aware it sometimes was, somewhat closed and difficult to read. He stopped. He looked at her directly. He said quietly, because he could still produce his own voice even if he could not hear it properly, "I cannot hear you. I apologize." The words came out rougher than they used to, because 3 years of not hearing yourself speak does that to a voice, flattens it, scrapes at the edges, but they were clear enough. And he watched her face for the look he expected. It did not come. What came instead was a brief, still moment, not pity, not discomfort, but something more like careful attention, the way a person looks when they have just received information that requires them to reorganize their approach. Then Harriet Alden shifted the crate of primers to her left hip, reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a small pencil stub, which she used to write 3 words on the brown paper wrapping of his parcel, which was still tucked under his arm. She held the pencil out toward him, and he understood that she wanted him to write back. He looked down at what she had written. It said, "Are you well?" He almost smiled. It had been a very long time since anyone had asked him that question without the pity written all around it. He took the pencil and wrote beneath her words, "I will be if my coffee survives the fall." He held the parcel out so she could read it, and he watched her face when she did. And she laughed. He could see the laugh even if he could not hear it, could see it in the way her whole expression changed, the way the corners of her eyes creased and her chin lifted and her shoulders shook slightly. And it was one of the most genuine laughs he had seen on a human face in 3 years of watching human faces. She wrote, "Your coffee survived. The primers are debatable." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with those changeable October eyes, and there was nothing in her face that made him want to walk away. He wrote, "I am Elijah Stone." She wrote, "I know. I am Harriet Alden. I am very glad to meet you properly." He folded his parcel under his arm, tucked the pencil stub into his shirt pocket before she could protest, and gave her a slight bow of his head that he was aware probably looked somewhat old-fashioned, but that was the best he could offer given the circumstances. Then he walked on down the street, and the silence settled back around him like always. But it felt different now. It felt like a silence that something was pressing against from the outside, trying to get in. The weeks that followed had a quality that Elijah found difficult to name. He had grown accustomed over 3 years to a life that existed mostly in parallel to other people's lives, running alongside them without intersecting, sharing space without sharing presence. Calla Springs was small enough that avoiding a person required effort, but he had become skilled at effort of that particular kind. What he had not accounted for was that Harriet Alden appeared to have no interest in being avoided. This was not aggressive on her part. She did not make a project of him which he would have found intolerable. She did not treat him as someone requiring management or assistance or pity. What she did was simply acknowledge him when their paths crossed, and she carried that pencil stub. And then, as the weeks went on, an actual proper pencil from the schoolroom, and she wrote things to him. Not always important things. Sometimes she wrote things like, "The Whitmore children are absolutely feral, but I believe there is hope in sometimes. I found a horned lizard in the schoolroom this morning, and I suspect Thomas Brill is responsible." He wrote back. He had begun, without quite deciding to do so, to carry a small notebook in his coat pocket, and he wrote his responses in it and held it out to her, and she read them and responded, and the conversations were halting and impractical and about nothing of consequence, and he looked forward to them with a sharpness that alarmed him slightly when he examined it honestly. October arrived, and the leaves on the pecans along the creek turned gold and fell in long drifts into the water, and the nights went cool enough that the ranchers in the valley began gathering their cattle off the higher pastures. Elijah worked long days for Holt and came back to his cabin at dusk with his muscles aching in the clean, honest way that outdoor work produces, and he ate simple food and slept soundly, and in the mornings he was aware, before he was fully awake, of something that was not quite anticipation but lived in the same neighborhood. One evening in mid-October, walking back from the creek where he had watered his horse, he passed the schoolhouse and saw the light still burning in the window. This was not unusual. Harriet often worked late, and he had noticed the pattern without admitting to himself that he had noticed. But on this particular evening the door was open slightly, and he stopped because something made him stop, some instinct or some gravity, and he stood in the cooling dark and looked through the open door at the interior of the little limestone schoolroom. Harriet was sitting at the teacher's desk, not grading papers or preparing lessons. She was sitting very still with her hands folded on the desk in front of her and her head slightly bowed, and the lamplight was on her hair and on her hands, and the expression on her face was one he had not seen her wear before. It was the expression of someone who was tired in a way that goes deeper than the body. Not defeated, Harriet Alden did not appear to be a person easily defeated, but carrying something. The way a person looks when they have been carrying something for a long time and the weight is true. He did not go in. He was aware that he had no right to the moment he was witnessing, and he stepped back from the door and went on toward his cabin. But he carried what he had seen with him the way you carry a small stone in your boot, not painful exactly, but present. The next morning, when he passed the dry goods store and Harriet was coming out with a wrapped parcel of her own, she wrote him a note that said, "I heard from my mother in Austin last evening. She is unwell. I am sorry, I think I am in rather low spirits this morning." He took the pencil and wrote back, "I am sorry about your mother. Low spirits on a morning like this one are entirely understandable." She read it and looked up at him, and he thought she might say something more, but instead she just nodded once, a small, real nod, the kind that means "I understand that you understand," and went on down the street. He stood there for a moment in the October morning, and the silence was enormous, and he was very aware of how much he wished he could have said the words out loud and heard them land, heard her voice come back to him with whatever it might carry. He had not wished for that, specifically, in a very long time. Wishing to hear sound in general was a grief he had mostly learned to set aside, the way you eventually learn to set aside the grieving of anything that is not coming back. But wishing to hear her voice, that particular voice, those specific words, was a sharper thing, and he recognized it for what it was and let himself recognize it for what it was, because denying it seemed like adding one more silence to an already sufficient supply. He was in love with her. He did not know quite when it had happened. It had not been a sudden event like the bullet 3 years ago. It had been a slow accumulation, the way limestone is laid down in water layer over invisible layer, until one day there is something solid enough to build on. He was in love with her, and he could not hear her voice, and she was a woman who used her voice professionally, who shaped children's minds with language and read aloud to them and sang probably, because teachers in those years were expected to lead singing, and he had never once heard a sound she made. He thought about this on his ride out to the eastern pasture the following morning, watching the frost burn off the short grass in the strengthening sun, and he decided that the situation was what it was, and that it would not be made better by turning it over repeatedly, and that the most honest and reasonable course of action was to make no course of action at all and simply be decent to her and be grateful for what the conversations in pencil had given him, which was more of a genuine human connection than he had allowed himself in 3 years. He managed to maintain this sensible position for approximately 2 more weeks. It collapsed on an evening in early November when he arrived at the saloon to eat. Mrs. Tully sometimes provided meals, but on this particular evening she had other arrangements, and found Harriet Alden seated at the small table near the window, eating alone, with her stack of papers beside her because she apparently could not stop working even while eating. The place was moderately full, the usual ranchers and hands, and there was a man at the bar who Elijah recognized as a cattle buyer named Darnell Wade, who came through Calla Springs twice a year, and who Elijah had never found particularly tolerable, primarily because of the way Wade looked at women, not directly threatening, but assessing, as if calculating value. Wade was looking at Harriet now, and he appeared to be saying something to the man beside him and laughing, and while Elijah could not hear what was said, he could see from the angle of Wade's face and the direction of the laugh that it was at Harriet's expense, and she likely knew it. Her expression had not changed. She was still reading her papers, but her hand had tightened very slightly on her fork. Elijah picked up his plate and coffee and walked to her table and sat down across from her, which was an act of social boldness that surprised him as he was doing it. She looked up. He met her eyes and then glanced once toward the bar in a way that communicated, he thought, that he had seen what was happening, and then he looked back at her and opened his notebook to a blank page and wrote, "Would you mind the company?" She looked at the notebook and then back at him, and then she smiled. Not the bright laugh smile, but a quieter one, the kind that has something grateful in it, and she wrote back, "I would very much not mind." They ate in a companionable quiet that, Elijah reflected, was perhaps not entirely different for him than it was for hearing people, since the sounds of a saloon at evening, which he understood must be considerable, were entirely unavailable to him, and they therefore existed in the same acoustic world, which was to say no acoustic world at all, and he found this oddly leveling. When he was nearly done with his meal, she wrote, "Can I ask you something personal?" He wrote, "You may." She wrote, was it a gradual loss or sudden? He looked at what she had written and then at her face, and he saw in her expression the same careful attention he had seen that first day, not pity but genuine interest, the kind of interest that is actually about the person and not about oneself. He wrote, "Sudden, a gunshot 3 years ago. The bullet did not damage the ear itself. The doctors believed it was something in the brain." She read it and nodded slowly. Then she wrote, "Does it hurt?" He considered this. He wrote, "Not physically, not anymore." She looked at him steadily, and he had the feeling she understood what was contained in that "not anymore." She wrote, "I think you are very brave." He felt something shift in his chest at that, something that had been very carefully positioned and was now not positioned quite so carefully anymore. He wrote, "I think you mistake endurance for bravery. They are different things." She wrote, "Sometimes endurance is the braver thing. Ask me tomorrow if you do not believe me now." He looked at her and she was looking at him, and the lamplight in the saloon was amber and warm, and from the corner of his eye he could see that Darnell Wade had turned back to the bar and appeared to have found a different subject for his commentary, and everything in Elijah's immediate world was as good as it had been in a very long time. He wrote finally, "I will ask you tomorrow, Harriet." It was the first time he had used her name in writing, and she looked at it on the page of his notebook, and something crossed her face that he thought, with some careful hope, might be the same thing he was feeling. Calla Springs in November had a particular quality to it, the air gone sharp and clean, the distant ridgelines bare and blue-gray, the smoke from chimneys rising straight in the still mornings. Elijah's work with Holt had shifted from the outdoor writing work to repairs of the barn and fencing on the property nearer the house, which kept him closer to town. And this coincidence, he called it a coincidence, though he was aware it was not quite meant that he passed through town more frequently, and he and Harriet fell into a pattern that felt as natural and as quietly astonishing as anything he had experienced. They met in the morning sometimes, when she was opening the schoolhouse and he was passing with supplies. They met at noon when the children were released for the midday break, and he was sometimes at the dry goods store. And on several evenings each week, she allowed herself to stop working at a reasonable hour, and they walked together along the creek path, passing the notebook back and forth, the conversations ranging widely and without particular destination. Her childhood in Austin, his years before the shooting when he had ridden for various outfits across Kansas and Colorado, her views on the education of children in frontier settlements, his views on cattle and horses, and the specific character of different kinds of country. She had grown up reading extensively, which was evident from the way she thought, and she brought a reference or a comparison to almost everything, which he enjoyed, because it meant that conversations were not simply exchanges of information but explorations. She could connect the practice of teaching children mathematics to something she had read about the way Roman engineers built aqueducts, and then connect that to the limestone geology of the Texas Hill Country, and then circle back to how Thomas Brill could not seem to remember his multiplication tables no matter what method she employed. And there was a quality of mind in the movement that he found genuinely delightful. He was also aware, in the way one becomes aware of things that are both very close and very large, that he wanted badly to hear her voice. It had become a specific wanting now, not the general grief of his deafness, but a particular desire that had her name on it. When he watched her teach, he had stopped at the schoolhouse window once or twice, which he acknowledged was probably eccentric of him but could not quite stop doing. He could see the way she used her voice, could see from the children's faces that it was a voice worth hearing, could see from the way they leaned toward her when she read aloud that she was doing something with sound that was producing something real in them. He wanted to know what that was like. He wanted it the way you want water in a dry summer, with a specificity that has no polite substitute. He did not tell her this because he was not certain what could reasonably be done about it, and because saying it seemed like asking her to fix something unfixable, and he did not want her to carry that. What he did not know, could not know, because the information lived in sound and sound was not available to him, was that Harriet had been thinking about this too. She had been thinking about it since the evening at the saloon, and she had been thinking about it with the same careful, practical energy she brought to every problem worth solving. She had made, in the privacy of her room at Mrs. Tully's, a list of things she knew about how sound traveled through bone rather than air, which she had read about in a medical text she had found in Austin years ago, and which she now wished she had brought with her. She had written a letter to a doctor in San Antonio who had a reputation for being knowledgeable about such conditions, asking whether anything had changed in the understanding of the medicine involved. She had thought about, and then set aside several ideas that seemed impractical or intrusive or likely, to make Elijah feel like a project rather than a person. What she had not done, because she was Harriet Alden and therefore constitutionally incapable of pretending something was simpler than it was let herself think about these things without also thinking about the other thing, the thing that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the way she felt when he sat across from her in the lamplight and wrote in his quiet, precise handwriting and looked at her as if she were something genuinely worth looking at. She had not been looked at like that in a long time. She had not, in the interest of honest accounting, been looked at like that perhaps ever, and she was 26 years old and had been in love once before, with a young attorney in Austin who had been charming and interesting, and had eventually decided that a woman who intended to keep teaching school after marriage was not the arrangement he required. And she had been hurt by that in a way she had dealt with by working harder and reading more and eventually moving 300 miles west to a town that needed her to show up and do the work. She had not come to Calla Springs looking for anything except a fresh start and reliable students. She had not expected Elijah Stone. The letter from the San Antonio doctor arrived in the second week of December, and she read it 3 times in her room before she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat and went to find him. He was in the livery, which was where he often was in the late afternoon when the day's work was done, and old Jasper allowed him to use the space to work on his tack. She came in out of the cold afternoon, and he looked up from the bridle he was mending and saw her face, and his hands went still. She reached into her coat and took out the letter and held it out to him. He wiped his hands on his work trousers and took it and read it. She watched him read it. The letter from the doctor was not a miraculous thing. It did not promise restoration. It did not offer a cure from some new discovery. What it said, in careful medical language that Harriet had spent some time translating into plain sense, was that some cases of sudden hearing loss following traumatic head injury had been known to resolve partially, or in some cases wholly, over time, and that 3 years was not outside the range of possibility, and that the most significant predictor of partial resolution appeared to be the specific nature of the injury, and that without examining the patient the doctor could not say more, but that the patient might consider making the journey to San Antonio in the spring. Elijah read the letter twice. He folded it slowly along its original creases. He held it for a moment. Then he looked up at her, and she saw something in his face that was very carefully controlled and very large underneath the control. He handed the letter back to her. Then he took out his notebook and wrote very deliberately, "You wrote to this doctor for me." She wrote back, "Yes." He looked at what she had written for a moment. Then he wrote, "Why?" She held the pencil over the page and thought about what to write and decided to write what was true. She wrote, "Because I think you deserve to hear the world again, and because I find that your happiness has become rather important to me." She held the notebook out to him and watched him read it and watched his face, and what she saw there made something loosen in her chest, some bracing she had put up against the expectation of nothing, some armor she had not entirely admitted she was wearing. He took the notebook back. He held it for a long time. Then he wrote, "Harriet," just her name. And then, below it, "I do not know how to say what I want to say to you. I have been unable to say anything to anyone properly for 3 years. But I want you to know that whatever the world sounds like when I can hear it again, if I can hear it again, the first thing I want to hear is you." She read it. The livery was cold and smelled of horse and straw and old leather, and the light through the high window was the pale, flat light of a December afternoon. And she read what he had written and looked up at him, and he was looking at her with that steadiness that she had come to understand was not distance, but its opposite. A man paying full and genuine attention, because attention was the only currency that had been available to him, and he had learned to spend it without reservation. She said out loud, into the silence between them, knowing he could not hear it, saying it anyway, "Then I will make sure there is something worth hearing when that day comes." He could not hear her, but he could read her face, and he had become very good at reading her face, and he understood enough of what she had said to take her hand, which he did carefully, his work-rough fingers closing around hers, and she let him. And they stood in the cold December livery with the horse shifting behind them and the thin winter light and the pen and notebook world that was the whole of their spoken language. And it was enough. And it was also the beginning of something they both understood was going to require them to be very brave. Christmas came to Calla Springs with a cold, bright clarity that made the limestone hills look painted. The town gathered in the whitewashed church for a service that Elijah attended not because the sermon was available to him, but because Harriet was going to play the church's small organ. She had discovered that Mrs. Tully played, or had played before her arthritis, and had spent several evenings in November practicing. And even if he could not hear the music, he could watch her hands on the keys and see the way the sound moved through the people in the church, through their faces and their bodies. The way the singing straightened some of the older women's shoulders and made the children go uncharacteristically still. He sat near the back and watched her at the organ, and she was concentrated and precise, and there was a small furrow between her brows that appeared when she was working at something that mattered to her, and the people around him were singing in the amber lamplight, and he was sitting in a sphere of personal silence inside all of that sound, and he was not unhappy. He was the furthest thing from unhappy. After the service, in the cold, clear night outside, she found him and he tucked her hand into his arm because it was cold and the gesture was natural, and she leaned into it slightly, and they walked a little way down the street while the rest of the town dispersed in the cheerful, disorganized way of post-church evenings. She pulled out the notebook. She had started keeping it herself since it was the shared property of their conversations, and wrote, "Merry Christmas, Elijah." He wrote back, "Merry Christmas, Harriet." She wrote, "I am very glad I came to Calla Springs." He wrote, "I am also very glad, though I believe the lumber removal alone should have discouraged a lesser person." She laughed the laugh he could see but not hear, and bumped her shoulder against his arm, and the night was cold and clear, and the stars over the Texas hills were extraordinary, and he tucked her hand a little tighter into his arm and she did not pull away. They did not kiss that night. He was a careful man, and he wanted to be certain, wanted her to be certain, and the wanting itself had a quality of sweetness that he was not in a hurry to rush past. January brought harder cold and a period of rain that turned the main street of Calla Springs to mud and kept the valley ranchers mostly close to their operations. Elijah spent the rainy days repairing the inside of Holt's barn, and came back to his cabin in the evenings with the smell of wet wood and paint on his clothes. He had begun to write letters to Harriet, actual letters, longer than the notebook exchanges, written in the evenings by lamplight when the rain was coming down on the cabin roof in a sound he could feel more than hear, a low vibration that was something like company. The letters were different from the notebook conversations, less immediate and more considered, and he found that he could say things in them that the face-to-face exchange, even in writing, did not quite accommodate. He wrote about what he remembered of music, which had been one of the things he had grieved in the silence. He had played a passable harmonica before the shooting, which now sat in his saddlebag unused. He wrote about what the silence had been like in the first months, when it had been so total and so strange that he had sometimes wondered if he had died and simply not been informed. He wrote about the way fear worked in a man who could not hear, who could not orient himself by the acoustic geography that hearing people used without knowing they used it, who went into every saloon and every street and every dark night without the early warning that sound provides. He had never written any of this to anyone. He had barely thought it clearly before, because clarity required some belief that the thoughts were being directed somewhere, and directing them nowhere had seemed like a waste of the effort of honesty. Harriet wrote back. Her letters were long and careful and vivid, and sometimes funny in a dry, precise way that he was learning to look for, and she wrote about Austin and her mother, who had improved somewhat to her relief, and about the children in the school who were beginning, most of them, to show actual progress, and about what it had meant to her to leave everything familiar and come to a place like Calla Springs, which was not what she had expected but had turned out to be, she wrote. The best unanticipated thing that had happened to her in several years. He kept all her letters in a tin box under the bed of his cabin, and this was perhaps the most honest indication of what he felt about her, because Elijah Stone was not a man who kept things. 3 years of moving had stripped him to essentials, and the tin box with her letters in it was becoming an essential. February came and went, and in March the valley started greening from the bottom up, the creek banks first and then the slopes of the ridgelines, and the weather eased into something almost gentle. Elijah began thinking seriously about the trip to San Antonio. He thought about it with the same kind of careful management of hope that he had applied to most things since 1878. Meaning, he tried to think about it practically, to focus on the logistical realities and not on the possibility, which was not a promise and was maybe not even a probability, that the doctor in San Antonio could tell him something useful. He thought about it practically and found that he could not quite manage to think about it only practically, because Harriet was involved in it now, and Harriet had a way of making things feel possible that he had not experienced since before the shooting. He told her on a warm, early March evening on the creek path, walking with the notebook as they always did, that he was going to make the trip in April. She wrote immediately, "I am going with you." He took the notebook back and looked at what she had written and then at her and wrote, "That is not necessary. It is a 3-day ride." She wrote, "I am aware. I am also aware that you have not been to a city in some time and that navigating a city without hearing is considerably more difficult than navigating Calla Springs, and that I am your primary means of written communication with any doctor you consult. So I am going with you." He looked at this for a long moment. He wrote, "The school term." She wrote, "The school term breaks for 2 weeks at Easter. I have already consulted the calendar." He looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression she wore when she had thought something through thoroughly and was prepared for all objections, which was, he had come to know, most of her expressions. He wrote finally, "Your reputation, if we travel together." She took the notebook before he could finish and wrote, "We can travel with a chaperone. Mrs. Penny Holt has mentioned she has a sister in San Antonio she has been meaning to visit. I believe I can arrange it." He read this and looked at her, and she raised her eyebrows slightly, which was Harriet Alden for, "I have thought of everything. Have you more objections?" He wrote, "I do not have more objections," she wrote. "Good. Then it is settled." He wrote after a pause, "Thank you." She looked at the word for a moment and wrote beneath it, "You do not need to thank me for this." He wrote, "I know. I am thanking you anyway." She folded the notebook page over carefully, which was a habit of hers with pages she wanted to preserve, and put the notebook back in her coat pocket. And they walked on along the creek in the early March evening with the water running high and cold from the winter rain and the first green things coming up on the banks. And she did not take his arm, but their hands were close enough together that twice, when the path narrowed, their fingers brushed. The journey to San Antonio in the second week of April was, in its practical arrangements, exactly what Harriet had planned. 3 days' travel with Penny Holt sitting in the wagon seat and providing the chaperone that Elijah's concern for Harriet's reputation required. Elijah riding alongside on his roan, the limestone hills giving way gradually to broader and flatter country as they moved south. Penny Holt was a forthright woman who had immediately grasped the communication situation and had, without being asked, taken to writing down anything she thought Elijah might want to know, which he found both useful and touching. San Antonio in the spring of 1882 was a city of some size and considerable noise, of which Elijah was aware only in its visual and physical aspects, the volume of people and vehicles in the streets, the vibration in the ground from iron-wheeled wagons on stone paving, the press of bodies, and the activity of a place that was simultaneously old Spanish colonial and new American frontier, and several things in between. The doctor's name was Harlow. He was a small, precise man in his 50s who examined Elijah with serious attention over the course of a long morning, using instruments and conducting tests that Elijah endured with patience, and who then spoke with Harriet, who served as the communication bridge, writing everything down in the notebook. For some time while Elijah sat in the chair by the window and watched the street below. What Harriet wrote for him, on page after page of the notebook, was this: Dr. Harlow believed the injury to have affected the nerve pathways between the inner ear and the brain, rather than the ear itself. He believed that in some cases, not all but some, these pathways could partially recover over time, and that the recovery, when it happened, was sometimes gradual and sometimes sudden. He said there was nothing medical that could be done to force it. He said that the most documented cases of partial recovery had occurred between 2 and 5 years after the original injury. He said Elijah was now at just over 3 years. He said he could not promise anything, but that he would not tell a man there was no hope either, because the brain was still, in 1882, not fully understood, and a doctor who claimed otherwise was in Harlow's opinion a fool. Elijah read all of this carefully. He looked out the window at the San Antonio street. He looked back at Harriet, who had written all of this with her expression very steady and her hands entirely calm, and who was watching him now with the same calm attention. He wrote in the notebook, "What does he recommend?" She wrote back, "He says continue with your life. He says do not wait in the silence. He says the waiting is the worst thing for it." Elijah read this. He thought of 3 years of waiting, though he had not thought of it as waiting, had thought of it as simply the shape his life had taken. He thought of Harriet Alden and the notebook and the tin box of letters under his bed. He thought of the harmonica in his saddlebag. He wrote, "I have not been waiting. I have been living somewhat inadequately." She read this and looked at him, and the look she gave him was very direct and very clear and said more than the notebook could hold. They stayed in San Antonio for 3 days. Penny Holt visited her sister and gave them a considerable amount of unchaperoned time, which Elijah was aware was somewhat deliberate on her part, and which he appreciated without saying so. He and Harriet walked the streets of the old city together, stopping at the market where vendors sold things he could not identify and Harriet could, writing him their names in the notebook. They ate tamales sitting on the steps of the San Fernando Cathedral, which was 200 years old and still entirely functional, and Harriet wrote him a brief history of the building that she knew partly from reading and partly from asking the woman who had sold them the tamales. On the last evening, sitting by the river in the warm April dark with the cottonwoods pale and enormous against the sky, he put the notebook away in his coat pocket. She watched him do it. Then he reached over and took her hand, not the careful way he had taken it in the livery in December, but with a directness that was something new, something that had not been available before today and was available now. And she turned her hand over in his so that their fingers were properly interlaced, and he looked at her in the dark by the river, and she looked back at him, and he leaned forward slowly enough that she understood what was coming and could easily have leaned away, and she did not lean away. He kissed her very carefully, and she kissed him back not carefully at all, and the San Antonio River moved past them in the dark with whatever sound it made, and the cottonwoods were luminous in the moonlight, and every single thing that needed to be said had been said, just none of it with words. The ride back to Calla Springs had a different quality to it than the ride down. Penny Holt sat in the wagon seat and smiled to herself, and found reasons not to look directly at either of them, and the hill country came back green and dramatic in the April warmth, and Harriet rode beside Elijah on the horse Mrs. Tully had lent her, and they passed the notebook back and forth as they always had, but now when their hands touched in the exchange, there was nothing accidental about it, and the notebook exchanges had taken on a warmth that was almost visible, and the conversations were the same as they had always been about everything and nothing, about the country they were passing through and the work waiting at home and a book she had been reading, but also entirely different. Because underneath all of it was the river and the dark and the fact of her kiss, and that fact was changing the whole quality of the world. He proposed to her in May. He had thought about it carefully, which was his way with things that mattered, and he had thought about fairness, about whether it was fair to ask a woman to marry a man who might spend the rest of his life in silence, who communicated in notebooks, who could not hear her voice. And he had arrived at the conclusion that it was not his place to decide what was fair for Harriet Alden, who was a person with complete capacity to make her own determinations. What he could do was be honest and ask, and leave the answer entirely in her hands. He had also, and this was perhaps the more practically important step, spoken with Caleb Marsh about the possibility of securing a piece of land in the valley rather than working as a hand for Holt. Marsh had been more helpful than expected. He was a man who understood the value of good workers and who appeared, from his manner, to have noticed that the schoolteacher had made the valley a better and more orderly place and had some interest in keeping her there. There was a piece of land on the eastern creek that had gone back to Marsh after the previous owner had moved on. 40 good acres with a solid limestone foundation poured for a house that had never been completed, and they had arrived at a reasonable arrangement. He took Harriet out to the land on a Sunday afternoon in early May, the bluebonnets still thick in the lower meadow, and the creek running clear and cold over flat limestone shelves. He showed her the foundation, the limestone blocks laid precisely, the corner posts still sound, the view from the site out over the lower valley to the distant ridgeline. She walked the perimeter of it with that level-headed assessment she brought to physical spaces, checking the quality of the stone, looking at the elevation above the creek. Then he opened the notebook and wrote, "I bought this land. I intend to build a house on this foundation." She looked at this and at him, and he could see her thinking. He wrote, "I am asking you, Harriet, if you would be willing to share the house." She stood very still in the May afternoon, the blue sky enormous above them and the bluebonnets moving slightly in the warm wind. She took the pencil and wrote, "Are you asking me to marry you?" He wrote, "Yes, in the most direct and honest way I know how to ask it." She read this twice. Then she wrote, "I want to tell you something first." He wrote, "Tell me." She wrote, "I came to Calla Springs expecting nothing but work. I have never been more grateful for being entirely wrong about a place. I have never known anyone who listened the way you listen, who was as fully present as you are, who treated me like my thoughts and words and work were actually worth something. The fact that you cannot hear my voice has never once made me feel like you were not hearing me. I think that is the most remarkable thing I have ever experienced. He read every word. He read them twice because they deserved it. She wrote underneath, "Yes. My answer is yes. I will very gladly marry you." He looked at her, and she was looking at him, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears, and was not quite laughter but lived between them. And he closed the notebook and put it in his pocket, and pulled her to him right there on the limestone foundation in the bluebonnet meadow. And she came without hesitation. And he held her for a long time with the Texas spring all around them, and the creek, a cold, clear sound that he could feel in the soles of his boots against the stone. They were married in June, in the whitewashed limestone church, on a morning when the heat was already building but had not yet become oppressive, and the valley was green and gold, and the circuit preacher happened to be making his regular visit, which Harriet declared was a favorable omen of good timing. The whole of Calla Springs came. This was not an exaggeration. The town was small enough that the whole of Calla Springs fit in the church, with room for the Holt Ranch hands standing along the back wall. Jasper Coyne was there. Caleb Marsh was there. The children from the school were there, dressed in varying degrees of formality. Penny Holt sat in the front pew and cried in the open and cheerful way of a woman who sees love arriving at a good destination and is thoroughly pleased about it. Elijah stood at the front of the church in the good coat that Harriet had overseen the pressing of, because his own pressing technique was apparently not up to her standards, and watched Harriet come down the aisle in a dress that was a blue-gray, the color of the October Creek water, and carried wildflowers from the meadow, because she had opinions about the unnecessary expense of ordering flowers from Austin when the meadow was full of them. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The preacher spoke the words that Harriet had written out for Elijah beforehand so he could follow along, and Elijah read from his card and spoke his vows aloud in the rough, careful voice that 3 years of silence had given him. And Harriet spoke her vows looking directly at him in the way she had of communicating across the acoustic gap, her whole face present and unguarded and entirely for him. And he caught enough of the shape of the words on her lips to know she meant everyone. When it was done and the preacher indicated the conclusion, Elijah kissed his wife and the people of Calla Springs. All 27 adults and 14 children of them made a sound he could feel in his chest as a warm vibration, and Harriet laughed into the kiss and then pulled back and looked at him with shining eyes, and he thought, "Even if I never hear another thing, I have this." Summer came to the valley in its fullness, hot and bright, the creek dropping to half its spring volume and the cattle moving slow in the pastures. Elijah and a hired carpenter worked on the house through July and August, the limestone walls going up course by course in the way of the hill country, where stone was abundant and wood was not. Harriet helped where she could and opinionated productively about window placement and the orientation of the kitchen, and they took their midday meals under the big pecan tree by the creek while the carpenter napped, and the heat was at its most serious. In September, school started again, and Harriet went back to her classroom with the evident pleasure of a person returning to work they love, and the valley children came back to their books, and Elijah watched her walk to school in the mornings from the window of their not-yet-finished house. The roof was on, and the floors were laid, which was the important part, and felt something that was very close to the complete opposite of what the previous 3 Septembers had felt like. The morning it happened was a morning in late October. He woke at first light as he always did, with the room pale and the air cold enough to be visible, and Harriet was still asleep beside him, her hair loose and dark against the pillow, and he lay still for a moment in the morning quiet. And in the quiet something moved. It was not sound exactly. It was the edge of sound, or what he thought was sound, a quality in the air that had not been there before, like the difference between a room with a window open a crack and a room sealed entirely. He lay very still, afraid to move, afraid the thing would go away if he disturbed it. He had experienced in 3 years a few moments that had felt like this phantom sounds, tricks of the memory or the brain reasserting itself and then retreating, and he had learned not to place weight on them. But this was different in degree. This was not a phantom. This was something structural, something that felt like a door that had been locked for 3 years and was now very slightly ajar. Outside, a bird called. He heard it. Not perfectly, not clearly, not with the full richness that sound had once carried. It was thin and distant, like something heard through a wall, but he heard it. The shape of it. The reality of it. A bird calling in the October morning, outside the window of the house he had built on the limestone foundation in the bluebonnet meadow. He sat up very slowly. He put his feet on the cold floor. He sat there breathing carefully, listening or trying to listen or beginning, maybe, to listen, while around him the thin pale dawn came through the window and the morning had the whole electric quality of something that was not supposed to be possible. He turned to look at Harriet. She was awake. He did not know when she had woken. She slept light, always had, and she was lying on her side looking at him. And she had seen the thing on his face because she could always see the thing on his face. And her expression was very still and very careful, the expression of a person who hopes so much they will not move in case the movement disturbs it. He reached over to the bedside table where the notebook lived always, because old habits were structural, and he picked up the pencil. He wrote, "I think I heard a bird." She sat up so quickly the blanket fell away, and she looked at what he had written, and her face was the full, unguarded version of every best thing he had ever seen on it. He held up one finger, "Wait," and then he pointed at her, and then at his ear, and she understood immediately, with the fluency of someone who had spent a year learning to communicate with him and knew every gesture. She looked at him for a moment. She put her hand against his face, her palm warm against his jaw, the same way she always touched him when she wanted to be certain he was attending, and she looked at him directly, and she said something. He could not hear it fully. It was still thin, still through the wall. But it was there, a voice, a real human voice, shaped and warm and unmistakably hers. He could not make out the words. But the fact of it, the fact of her voice, arriving in the silence that had held him for 3 years, hit him somewhere behind the ribs with a force that was physical, that was grief and joy in the same exact moment, the way you feel something when it comes back that you had finished grieving. His eyes were wet. He was aware of this and was not troubled by it. He wrote in the notebook with a hand that was not entirely steady, "Say it again." She looked at what he had written and she said it again, and this time he caught more of it, still imperfect, still partial, like light through a thick curtain rather than a clear window, but real. It was real. Her voice was real, and it was arriving in him, and it was the first human voice he had heard in 3 years of silence. He wrote, "I can hear you. Not completely, but I can hear you." She read this and pressed her lips together for a moment, and then he watched her face do the thing it did when she was feeling something too large for a single expression, cycle through several things rapidly and arrive at something quieter and deeper underneath. Then she took the notebook from him and wrote, her handwriting slightly less precise than usual, which told him something about the state of her hands. "I told you there would be something worth hearing." He remembered. He remembered writing that in the livery, in December of the previous year. "The first thing I want to hear is you." And he had not known then how exactly it would be true. He had not known that it would be a cold October morning in a limestone house with bluebonnet fields outside the window, and 3 years of accumulated silence breaking open like frozen ground in spring. He put down the notebook and pulled her into him, and she came, and they sat in the early morning with the October light coming in and the birds still calling outside somewhere in the pecans. And she said something against his shoulder that he could not quite make out, and he did not ask her to repeat it because, whatever it was, he could feel it in the warmth of her breath against his neck. And that was enough, and more than enough, and the beginning of something that was still increasing. In the weeks and months that followed, the hearing returned the way the doctor had said it might, not all at once, not perfectly, but in increments that were sometimes dramatic and sometimes so gradual as to be nearly imperceptible. By November, he could hold a conversation if the speaker was close and the environment was relatively quiet. By December, he could hear music imperfectly, with a quality that Harriet described, when he tried to explain it to her, as somewhat like hearing through water but music nonetheless. The hymns in the church on Christmas morning, and his own harmonica when he took it out of the saddlebag for the first time in 3.5 years, and played a few careful notes in the cold kitchen. The harmonica sounded wrong and right at the same time. Wrong because his hearing was still not complete, still partial and slightly distorted at certain frequencies. Right because it was sound. It was his own sound. He played 3 bars of something he had known before the shooting, and then stopped and sat at the kitchen table in the thin December light and breathed. Harriet came in from the front room where she had been reading, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him, and he looked at her. He played the 3 bars again. He looked at her face while he played them and watched the expression that moved across it, which was very soft and very full. And this was, he understood, what it looked like to play music for someone, and he had not known what that looked like until now. She came into the kitchen and sat across from him, and he played to her in the December morning. Simple things, old things, things with tunes that were familiar, and she listened with her hands folded on the table and her face open, and outside the window the winter valley was pale and cold and beautiful. That winter Harriet told him she was expecting their first child. She told him by writing it in the notebook, because old communication habits were not gone simply because the new ones were improving, and because some things deserved the specificity and care of written words. She sat across from him at the kitchen table one January evening after supper and slid the notebook across, and he read what she had written, and the thing that happened in his chest was so large and so sudden that he simply sat there for a moment holding the notebook and looking at the words. He looked up at her. She was watching him with that careful stillness she had when she was waiting for his reaction to something large. And he saw in her face that she was happy and also perhaps slightly nervous, which was unusual for Harriet, and the combination of the two things was one of the most endearing things he had ever seen. He reached across the table and took both her hands and held them and looked at her, and whatever was on his face was enough for her because the nervousness left and the happiness grew, and they sat like that for a long time in the winter kitchen. He wrote eventually, "I am going to need a larger house." She looked at this and laughed. He could hear the laugh now, a full and real sound, though still with the quality of slight distance, and wrote back, "You have an entire second room not yet furnished." He wrote, "That will barely cover the first few years." She wrote, "Are you expecting a large family?" He looked at her and wrote, "I am hoping for one. Is that acceptable?" She looked at what he had written, and her smile was the complete one, the one that reached everything. She wrote, "It is very acceptable." Spring came back to the valley, and Harriet's pregnancy advanced through the warmer months, and she continued teaching through most of it because she was Harriet Alden, and the idea of stopping work before it was strictly necessary was not in her constitution. And the children of Calla Springs showed a remarkable collective maturity about the situation that Elijah suspected was due to Harriet's having simply informed them clearly and without drama that their teacher was going to have a baby in the summer, and that they would be seeing a substitute for a period after that, and that anyone who made the situation into an excuse for misbehavior would find the fall term's curriculum had been adjusted. Accordingly, in July of 1883, their son was born. He arrived on a hot, clear morning with the help of the valley's midwife and Mrs. Penny Holt, who turned out to have attended considerably more births than her cheerful demeanor would suggest. And Elijah was in the front room because that was where midwives and husbands stood in those years, pacing a path in the limestone floor and wearing out the knuckles of his right hand against the window frame, listening. And he could listen now, or something close to it, to the sounds from the bedroom. When the cry came, thin and new and outraged at the sudden existence of the world, it went through him like the October bird had gone through him, Like Harriet's voice the first morning, something that was supposed to be there and had returned. Something that carried meaning beyond its own immediate content. Penny Holt opened the bedroom door and said something that he caught most of, which was that they were both well and would he like to come in now, and he went in. Harriet was propped against the pillows, tired in a way that was comprehensive and triumphant simultaneously, and in her arms was a wrapped bundle that was making small sounds of the specific kind that belong to new human beings alone, sounds that have no equivalent in the rest of the world's catalog of sounds. She looked up at Elijah when he came in, and her face was everything. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the bundle in his arms, and he held his son for the first time. And the baby opened dark eyes, Harriet's eyes already, the same changeable quality, and looked at him with the unfocused seriousness of a person still working out what eyes were for. He said aloud in the voice that had come back to him imperfectly but was steadily improving, the roughness smoothing as the months went on, "What do you want to call him?" She looked at him with slight surprise, because hearing him speak unprompted was still something that landed with a small, distinct impact, and then she said, "I thought Samuel, my grandfather's name." He heard her. Fully clearly, with all the warmth and texture that her voice carried and that he had been hearing more completely with each passing month. He said, "Samuel Stone," she said. "Samuel Stone," trying it, and smiled. He looked from his son's face to his wife's face, and held the weight and warmth of the baby against his chest, and the summer morning was coming through the window in long, flat blocks of light, and the valley outside was green and ordinary and entirely extraordinary, and the silence that had held him for 3 years was not gone, it lived in him still, as places that hold you for a long time continue to live in you, but it had been replaced at its core, in its most essential place, by sound. By her voice. By this, the years that followed had the quality of something built soundly, not without difficulty, because nothing without difficulty is built soundly, but with a foundation that held. Samuel grew from a bundle into a boy who had his mother's quickness and his father's steadiness, and who learned early that his father's hearing was different from other people's, and accepted this as simply a fact of his father. The way children accept the specific facts of their particular parents without questioning whether those facts are optimal. He was a child who asked questions about everything. Why the limestone was white, why the creek ran east, why horses had 4 legs and birds had 2. And Elijah answered all of them, patiently and specifically, because he had a 3-year deposit of silence to draw down on, and was not inclined to economize on words now that words were available to him. Harriet's hearing restored to full capacity. There had never been anything wrong with her hearing, which Elijah pointed out to her once, in the dry, affectionate way he had developed for teasing her, and she responded that she had merely been in a supportive role and could not be held responsible for the efficiency of the auditory system. He laughed when she said things like that. He had laughed at her long before he could hear her properly, and he laughed at her still, and it was one of the primary comforts and pleasures of his daily life. His own hearing continued to improve through his early 30s, though it never fully returned to what it had been before the shooting. Certain high frequencies were always thin for him, and in noisy environments he still lost more than other people. He had kept the habit of the notebook long after it was strictly necessary, and he and Harriet still wrote things to each other sometimes, particularly things that were too important to be entrusted only to the air, things that wanted the permanence of ink on paper. She kept all the notebooks. They filled a shelf in the front room of the stone house, spine after spine, the years of their conversations in writing, the record of everything they had built together through pencil and patience, and the absolute refusal to let silence be the final word. In the fall of 1885, Harriet gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Clara, who arrived with red hair that surprised everyone except Harriet, who mentioned calmly that her grandmother on her father's side had been a redhead. Clara was, from approximately the age of 2, the loudest member of the household, and Elijah considered this a private gift from the universe. To have lived in silence, and then to have produced a child who appeared constitutionally unable to maintain quiet for more than 4 consecutive minutes. He listened to her with a particular attentiveness, the attentiveness of a man who knew what silence was, and who found in the noise of children the opposite of that silence, which was not merely sound but presence. Calla Springs changed around them in those years. As frontier towns changed grew somewhat, got a proper telegraph office in 1884, got a second saloon that immediately produced a rivalry with the first one, got a doctor who set up a proper practice in 1885, and who was perfectly capable and not quite as interesting to talk to as Dr. Harlow in San Antonio, and lost a few people and gained a few more. The school grew, and the school board, such as it was, being largely Caleb Marsh and whichever ranchers he could convince to attend a meeting, eventually offered Harriet a salary that was more reliable than voluntary donations, which she accepted with a graciousness that did not fully conceal her opinion that it should have been reliable from the beginning. Elijah's 40 acres became 60 when the land adjacent came available, and he purchased it before anyone else could. He ran a small cattle operation, nothing on the scale of the major ranches, but enough to support the household comfortably, and he had a reputation in the valley for fair dealing and for the kind of physical competence that earned respect from men who spent their lives working with their hands. He also had a reputation, among the ranchers' wives and the people who paid attention to such things, for the way he was with his wife, which was quiet and consistent and entirely unperformative in its devotion. He had never stopped listening to her, not in the metaphorical sense but in the full literal sense, with the attention of a man who had been given back the ability to listen and intended to use it. He remembered specific things she said, returned to them later, built on them. He noticed when her voice had the quality that meant she was carrying something, and he asked always, and she told him always, and they worked through things together with the same combination of practicality and genuine feeling that had been in their notebooks from the beginning. She noticed that he had started playing the harmonica regularly again. He played in the evening sometimes, on the front porch of the stone house, with the valley going blue and gold in the last light, and Samuel doing whatever boys do in the yard and Clara asleep inside. She would sometimes come and sit beside him on the porch and listen, her shoulder against his, and he would play for a while and then stop, and they would sit in the evening without needing to fill it. Those evenings were perhaps the best single thing about his life, and he had thought about this enough to know it. In 1887, the autumn turning the valley gold and the mornings back to cold, Harriet told him she was expecting again. He had heard her tell him. He had heard her clearly, sitting across the kitchen table in the lamplight, her voice direct and warm and carrying in it the same mixture of happiness and slight nervousness that he had learned to recognize as the specific form her vulnerability took with things that deeply mattered. He had heard every word. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she looked at him, and he said out loud, "I am very glad," she said. "You always say that," he said. "I am always very glad." She laughed, and he heard the laugh, and it was the same laugh he had seen first and heard later, and had been hearing for over 6 years now without ever becoming accustomed to it, without ever reaching the place where it was simply background rather than something worth attending to. He suspected he would never reach that place, and he did not mind. Their third child, born in the spring of 1888, was another boy. They named him Robert, and he arrived with Elijah's dark hair and Harriet's disposition, which meant he was a calm, thoughtful child who watched everything and said little until he had something specific to say, which his father found deeply recognizable, and which his mother found both amusing and faintly humbling. The household had a particular energy in those years. Samuel, who was 5 by the time Robert arrived, taking his older brother duties with mixed seriousness. Clara, who was 2, conducting the household's daily chaos, and Robert, who looked at all of it from his various positions of observation and appeared to be compiling notes for future reference. Elijah moved through it all the way he had learned to move through the world in the years of silence, with attention, with patience, with the fundamental belief that what was present in front of him was worth the full weight of his presence in return. He had learned that in the silence, learned it the hard way, and it had not left him when the silence lifted. There was an evening in the summer of 1889 when all three children were in bed, and the house was quiet in the way it could only be quiet when the day's noise had been extensive and the quiet had a depth to it, an earned quality. He was on the front porch with the harmonica, and the valley was dark and close, and the stars were the full Texas stars, and Harriet came out and sat beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder in the way she had been doing for 8 years and which never felt ordinary. He played for a while. Then he put the harmonica down. "Do you remember the first morning, in October," she said, "when you heard the bird?" He said, "I thought of all the things I might hear first when it came back. I had thought about it sometimes in the years before, tried not to think about it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "And?" He looked at the dark valley, the faint gleam of the creek in the starlight, the limestone shapes of the hills against the sky. He said, "Your voice was the first thing I heard, after everything, after the bird. You said something and I heard you, and that was the thing." She was still for a long time. He could feel her breathing beside him. She said quietly, "I told you I loved you. That morning, that was what I said." He turned to look at her. She was looking back at him in the starlight. He said, "I know I could not hear the words then, but I felt it," she said. "And now," he said, "now I hear it every day." She took his hand in the dark and he held it. And the night was warm and the valley was full of the sounds of a Texas summer. The insects and the creek and the faint distant cattle and the wind in the cedar. And he heard all of it, imperfectly and incompletely, and with more gratitude than he had words for. He had been in silence for 3 years and in her voice for 8, and the arithmetic of it was simple. The silence had made him the person capable of appreciating what he had now, and what he had now was everything. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips, and she said something very soft that he heard and held inside him with the same care he had given to everything she had ever said or written to him, which was the care of a man who understood, at the molecular level, that words were not permanent and presence was not guaranteed, and who had therefore made a daily practice of treating both as if they were gifts, which they were. The house stood solid on its limestone foundation in the bluebonnet meadow, the walls straight and the roof sound, built by his hands and inhabited by the life they had made together. The notebooks were on the shelf inside. The harmonica was warm from his playing. Samuel and Clara and Robert slept in their rooms with the breathing of children who were safe and fed and known. And Harriet Alden, Harriet Stone, though she continued to be Harriet Alden to the school board and to her students, and to her own deep conviction that a woman's professional name was hers to keep, sat beside him on the porch of the stone house in the hill country summer and said something else, quiet and certain, and he heard it. He heard all of it. He would hear it and hear her for the rest of his life, which was long and full and more than enough. The silence had taken 3 years. Her voice had given him everything after.